Well, good morning, friends, on this strange Palm Sunday morning. Although the sun has been shining, the early plants are coming into bloom, tree buds are developing around us, but everyday life feels a bit bland. Is that how it feels for you? I know that some among us are really struggling right now with health concerns, with social withdrawal symptoms, with concern about finances. I guess some of us have concern about our hair as well. But we also have those who are experiencing real joy in their lives. Many of us are aware that Mame and Nana Kwame have had a new baby in their household. These are all good things in the midst of everything else that's going on. On our website page, as it is Palm Sunday, we've posted a short video clip just there on our website from Palm Sunday 2 years ago. If you want to put a bit of joy, a bit of smile on your face, take the time to watch it and maybe even join in with the singing. Thanks to our resident cameraman, Mr. Jimmy Ashimadi. And if you received our emails and information and you printed out and colored the palm branch PDF that we sent you by email, you could even wave it while you're watching. Hosanna! And here's a thought. If you have actually colored your own palm branch, have you thought about maybe sticking it on your door of your house or your apartment or in a window? Just kind of on this Palm Sunday to remind the world that there's something else going on. There's another story out there. Well, Palm Sunday is traditionally the beginning of Holy Week in our church calendar, a day of great celebration for the King of Kings riding into Jerusalem on the donkey. Then the week kind of goes downhill from there as we reflect on the struggles that Jesus faced from the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And we have the Last Supper with his disciples, his prayer time in the Garden of Gethsemane, his betrayal by Judas, his arrest, the beatings, the crucifixion, and his death and burial. If we set aside what we know now, that Resurrection Sunday is coming, you could say that this was a really bad week for Jesus. But that is where I want us take us today, to the struggle and the disappointment that Jesus was feeling. And then I want to ask us again, why? Why did Jesus enter this path that would lead to his death? So I invite you to meditate with me on the passion, on the self-giving, the willingness, the offering of Jesus Christ, and allow this story to confront us once again. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took Peter and the sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more, prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Come on, here comes my betrayer. There are several things that I want to bring to our attention in this brief story. First, I want to talk about the disciples whom he invites into his prayer time. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him, a bit further away from the rest of the disciples. We get the impression that these are his close comrades. Now, do you remember just a few weeks ago? These were the same ones who went up the mountain with him, where the glory of God was revealed, and Moses and Elijah appeared. Jesus was taking them there, deep into the experience of his incarnation, what it meant for the living God who could have conversations with Elijah and Moses, what it meant for the living God to come and take on human flesh. So Jesus asked these three to pray with him. Interestingly, the other disciples were left to chat and think about what happened at the supper they had just come from. But these three were asked to come and keep watch with me. Jesus was really hoping that they would be with him in this moment. Well, as we noticed, they don't keep watch. They don't stay awake. They don't support him in this troubling moment. They don't converse with the Father along with him. They fall asleep. I think when Jesus comes back, of course, he's a bit disappointed. Come on, guys. Couldn't you hang in there with me for just an hour? Now, I can understand these fellows. I'm a guy who can't stay up late at night. Prayer devotions, first thing in the morning? Yeah, sure. But not late at night. I'm more inclined to nod off to sleep. And remember, these guys have just gone through a very rough week of attacks from the Jewish leaders, and then this very emotional supper meal they've just come from, where Jesus washed their feet, where he talked about betrayal, where he talked about his own death. I'm sure they were exhausted, emotionally and physically wiped out from the week they had just had. But still, Jesus gives them a bit of a warning about the difference between our good intentions and how we let everyday needs take over. Jesus called that the temptation gap. To take our eyes off of God's plan, God's intention, and let everyday life overwhelm us so we just do nothing. We might say that was even Jesus' temptation. I think he was talking about himself as well as the disciples. That's what this prayer time is all about. Can I go ahead with the plan that God, the Trinity, had put in place before the world was created? Do you remember in Genesis 1 where it says the Trinity consulted together using the language of our and we? This was God's plan from the beginning. Jesus goes away and he prays some more, and then he comes back. They're still asleep. This time he doesn't say anything, but you can probably imagine the look on his face and the kind of slight to his emotions. Finally, when he's finished his prayer time, he returns. Okay, you're still sleeping. Come on, guys, get up. Now's the time. The final act is about to be played. So that's the story of Jesus with the committed, mature, believing disciples. The group of Jesus followers, his closest disciples, that's how they showed up for him. Let's go back to Jesus. What was Jesus feeling as he comes to this prayer time? Matthew says that Jesus goes aside to pray because he is sorrowful and troubled. And he specifically says to the three who come with him, My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. It's interesting that the name of this garden, located on the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem, Gethsemane, it means the olive press. This was the location in the olive grove where the olives were squashed and pressed to produce the oil. It's interesting that the gospel writers use that term for this moment in the garden because Jesus is feeling squashed and pressed. Luke's version of this story says that Jesus was so mentally and emotionally distressed that blood was emerging from his skin pores. This is an actual psychomedical condition called hematidrosis. Have you ever felt that kind of overwhelming weight or pressure from your life circumstances? I know that some of us are feeling that way right now during these days. It may be comforting to know that Jesus experienced this as well. He walked the pathway that we're walking. He was not exempt. He has experienced the totality of our human condition. How does Jesus pray when he's in this place of great distress? My Father, if it's possible, take this cup from me. You'll recall at the Last Supper just a few hours earlier, Jesus had referred to the cup they were drinking as my blood of the covenant. Jesus knew what was coming. His blood shed and his death. He asked for deliverance, for this evil thing to be removed. It says he prayed that way 3 times. And he went back and he asked his friends to pray the same prayer. Jesus wanted the support and encouragement of his brothers in this time. Will you pray with me? I'm sure they said, yes, we'll pray with you. They agreed with him in prayer, and then they fell asleep. Now, we know the outcome of Jesus' prayer. He was not delivered. The pain, the death were not removed. He would enter into this experience fully to the very end. And the Apostle Paul says, do we think we can avoid experiencing the same pain that Christ suffered? I'm sure that part of the distress of the disciples in the next days, as Jesus died and they were hidden away in that upper room, some of their distress was this sense of guilt that they had fallen asleep, that they had not prayed hard enough, with enough earnestness. If they had, maybe Jesus wouldn't have had to die. Have you ever felt that way when you prayed and the answer didn't come that you were hoping for? So that was one part of Jesus' prayer in the garden. Father, deliver me. Here's the other part. Yet, not as I will, but as you will. It's really the question of who's in charge, who's in control. Who is it that sees the big picture, the whole picture? Remember, Jesus had taught his disciples to pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now he's actually acting that out in his own life, accomplishing God's will on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus the Messiah knew God's intention from the beginning. In fact, he had spelled it out earlier at their supper time. My blood poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I think sometimes walking with Jesus in the center of God's will still take us through distress and suffering and even death for God's glory, for the sake of the kingdom. 2 weeks ago, Carol Lee talked about the blind man who received his sight. Last week, we talked about the death and resurrection of Lazarus. Amazing miracles. But what about the 25 or 35 years of blindness for that man before the miracle? What about Lazarus' pain in his illness and then the death and 4 days of grieving before the miracle? In the moment, for days, weeks, years, was God present with them? Well, yes, because the Scriptures assure us that God is at work even in the most desperate of circumstances. Jesus prayed his prayer for deliverance and then submitted his will to the Father's purposes. That's the posture of prayer and attitude of mind and spirit that Paul says in Philippians we should desire to have. Jesus' life mission was to willingly, in love, give his life in order to provide an alternative story, a story of love in the face of hatred, a story of healing in place of sickness, a story of restoration in place of brokenness, a story of selflessness rather than selfishness. The human suffering that's being reported in our news every day is heartbreaking, affecting some of us personally already, perhaps more to come. Tens of thousands of people dying around the world just from this COVID business. But we're well aware that there are many other sources of oppression and suffering and death that have really just been shifted off our news screens for a few weeks. Just before Christmas, I got news that my longtime friend, Jerry Wallace, that's him back when we all had hair and looked much cooler. We've been friends for 40 years or so. Well, I had news that Jerry had been diagnosed with aggressive cancer. And on Wednesday this week, Jerry's presence shifted into the arms of the Father. I've been following his posts the last couple of months on Facebook as he and his family and many others prayed for deliverance from this destructive illness. And yet there's always been peace and joy reflected in everything that he posted. As followers of Jesus, there is no experience we encounter where Jesus is not present with us. Jerry has just been delivered of the limitations and pain of his physical body. It is easy to be overwhelmed with what the media sends our way. And we will be impacted by the loss of family and friends and colleagues. But it's deeply comforting, I believe, to know that Jesus stands with us during these times, because he has experienced the same grief and disappointment that we have. But then Jesus, with love and compassion for the brokenhearted, said, "Let me offer myself as the solution for the forgiveness of all this brokenness, for the restoration of the new creation." Yes, at the level of our own personal need and salvation, but also for the brokenness of the world, the cosmos, as John 3:16 says. Offering the possibility of a new creation where the old passes away and all becomes new and alive. That's the story that we're called to live into. How will you live that story this week? of a recognition of the brokenness, but also a profound recognition that God is at work in the world, doing something beyond comprehension, beyond something that the news media don't even know how to report about. Palm Sunday, a day when we're normally together having a great time of celebration of the King of Kings, but today really in a place of pause and reflection. And what does it mean? Holy Week. There's a lot of things that happen in the life of Jesus during this week, and we often reflect on them. We'll miss Good Friday this week. We won't be able to gather next Sunday in joyful celebration of the resurrection. But please stay tuned for our plans again. On Wednesday, we do want to celebrate, and so we'll try to put together a package for next Sunday as we look forward to Resurrection Sunday. So please plan to join us again as we share our resources. Take a moment to listen to the worship music that we've combined together with this message today. What wondrous love is this, O my soul. Let me say a word of prayer in conclusion. When the truth-twisting accusations were spat in your face, Jesus, when the crowds chanted their execution call, when the nails forced their way through your flesh, things could have been different if not for your embrace of death. But you knew that love would lead to the cross. It always does, to laying down life for the beloved. And you embraced your death willingly, inviting us to follow. So if not for your embrace of death, we could never know what it is to love those who don't deserve it. We could never find the frustration to resist the injustice that steals dignity. We could never have our hearts broken at the grief and the need of strangers. We could never risk ourselves to challenge violence and corruption and abuse. But in answer to your call, we follow you into the embrace of death, laying down our lives in small acts of prayer, service, and justice, allowing the suffering of others into our hearts. And we ask that in some small way, our expressions of love and sacrifice might bring shalom. May your kingdom come. Amen. The Lord be with you these days, friends, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few days. Take care.